Nova Primis was a city of contradictions, a place where towering spires of polished metal rose into the sky, humming with the energy of a civilization at its peak, while below, in the shadowed alleys, the forgotten and forsaken withered in the cold. For Aelira, it had been a last hope. She had not known how long she had been in the alley, only that the snow had begun to feel less like a punishment and more like an embrace, a quiet urging to let go. Her arms curled tightly around Kael and Dain, shielding them from the cruel wind that howled through the steel corridors of the lower city. Kael whimpered against her chest, his tiny hands clutching at her tattered coat. Dain remained silent, though she could feel his body trembling against her side. He was always the strong one, too young to carry such a burden, yet bearing it all the same. Footsteps. Aelira's sluggish mind barely registered the sound at first. In this city, people passed without seeing, without stopping. But this time, something was different. A pause. The shift of weight on pavement. Then, light, warm and golden, spilling from an open doorway, silhouetting a figure against the cold. A man, dark hair dusted with snow. A heavy coat, blue eyes sharp yet wary. A human. Dain moved before Aelira could stop him, his small, frost-bitten fingers grasping for the stranger's coat. Please. His voice cracked, raw from cold and exhaustion. Help my mother. She. He swallowed, shivering violently. She's too cold. She can't. His words broke into a sob. The man's expression changed. His jaw tightened, his shoulders squared, as if making a decision he already knew he couldn't turn away from. Without a word, he shrugged off his coat, dropping it over Aelira's shoulders. The weight of it, the sheer warmth, nearly crushed her. Stay with me. His voice was rough, steady. Can you walk? Aelira tried to answer, but the words wouldn't come. The ice had stolen them. Then, before she could protest, strong arms lifted her. She barely had the strength to react. Dain followed, Kael clinging to her. For the first time in what felt like forever, they were no longer alone. Warmth. Not the flickering, fragile kind stolen in desperate moments, but something solid, real. Aelira woke slowly, her body unwilling to leave the safety of heat, her mind clawing through the fog of exhaustion. Soft fabric beneath her fingers. A couch. A thick blanket draped over her. The air around her was warm, filled with unfamiliar scents, human scents. Her breath hitched. Kael. Dain. She pushed herself upright too quickly, dizziness slamming into her like a physical blow. Easy. The voice was close. She turned sharply, finding the human standing a few feet away, arms crossed. His sharp blue eyes studied her, not unkind, but unreadable. She stiffened. Where are my children? Her voice was weak, hoarse, but steady. The man exhaled, then stepped aside. They were there. Dain, wrapped in a blanket too large for him, sitting upright, watching her. Kael, curled beside him, his small hands still tangled in the fabric. Aelira exhaled sharply. Relief made her weak. They're fine, the man said. They were half frozen, but I got them warm. Fed them. The little one barely ate before passing out. Aelira hesitated, mind racing. He had helped them. He had given them warmth, shelter. But she had been taught that no one gave without expectation. What do you want? She asked. The man blinked, then let out something between a laugh and a sigh. I just spent the last hour making sure you didn't freeze to death. If I wanted something from you, don't you think I would have asked by now? His tone was sharp, but not cruel. She didn't flinch. His name was Rivik. Days passed. Aelira remained cautious, always watching for the moment when Rivik would change, when his kindness would demand repayment. But that moment never came. He left for work and returned with supplies. He offered food without condition. He didn't touch her, didn't demand explanations she wasn't ready to give. Kael was the first to settle in, his boundless energy returning with warmth and food. Dain, ever more cautious, watched silently, analyzing everything. Rivik noticed. You're quiet, kid, he commented one evening, watching Dain over the rim of his coffee mug. Dain tensed slightly. Sure seems like it, Rivik added, before shrugging. Nothing wrong with that. Smart people think before they talk. Aelira saw the flicker of something in her son's expression, surprise, recognition. Their people had never praised silence. Humans were different. Rivik was different. It happened in the smallest moments. A glance held too long. A hesitation before stepping away. The way Rivik's voice softened when he spoke to the children. The way he looked at Aelira when he thought she wouldn't notice. She wasn't naive. She had known love once. She had known safety, belonging. And she had lost it all. But Rivik, he was patient. Steady. One night, she reached for him. Just a touch. Light as air, fingers brushing against his. A silent question. He answered by holding on. It was enough. For now, weeks turned into something more. Aelira worked. She repaired tech alongside Rivik, her hands finding purpose again. She provided, not just for herself, but for her children. Kael laughed. Dain began to trust. And Aelira. She found herself standing at the edge of something she did not have a name for. Rivik never pushed. He gave her space, let her move at her own pace. But she felt it, the weight of something unspoken between them. One night, she said what she had been afraid to say. I don't know how to exist like this. Rivik had been silent for a long moment. Then he had said, simply, then learn. And she wanted to. For the first time in a long, long time, she wanted more than just survival. She wanted this. She wanted him. And that terrified her. Aelira had spent her life knowing that hope was a dangerous thing. It was a fragile construct, as fleeting as warmth in the dead of winter, and just as easily taken away. But in the quiet moments, in the stolen glances and the steady presence of Rivik beside her, she could feel hope sinking its claws into her. She should have been afraid. She was. It started in the small things, the way Kael laughed more easily now, the way Dain no longer slept curled into himself like he was bracing for something. The way Aelira herself had started to let her guard slip, just a little, when she spoke to Rivik, when she let herself stand too close, let herself feel the warmth of his presence like it was something she could trust. One evening, as she worked on repairing a fried circuit board at Rivik's cluttered workbench, she caught him watching her. You always this focused? He asked, leaning against the counter. She glanced up. I was an engineer before. Rivik lifted a brow. Yeah? Thought you said your people didn't take in strays. You must have had value once. The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. I did, she admitted. Before she had become a widow. Before she had become something discarded, a weight too heavy for her people to carry. Rivik studied her for a long moment, then exhaled. Well, their loss. You've got a hell of a skill set. She didn't know what to say to that. Instead, she returned to her work, but she could still feel his eyes on her, as if he was trying to understand something even she didn't fully grasp. It had been almost a month since she and the children had first stepped into Rivik's home. The frostbite had faded from her skin, replaced with something softer. The children no longer flinched at every unfamiliar noise. It was dangerous, this comfort. Aelira knew better than to believe it would last. She could feel it in the way Rivik's expression darkened when he checked the news feeds, in the way he scanned the streets when they ventured out for supplies. Something was coming. She just didn't know what. Then, one evening, it came. A sharp knock at the door. Aelira stiffened, instinct clawing at her to grab the children and run. But there was nowhere to go. Rivik's expression hardened. He set down his cup, moving toward the door with the careful wariness of a man who knew trouble when he saw it. He opened it just enough to see who was on the other side. A shadowed figure stood in the dim hallway, the glow of cybernetic implants flickering in the cold light. Rivik, the stranger said, a voice edged with static, distorted through a vocal modulator. Rivik didn't move. Not a good time. The figure shifted, tilting their head slightly. Then make time. Aelira could see the tension in Rivik's shoulders, the weight of something heavy pressing down on him. He exhaled sharply, then stepped outside, shutting the door behind him. She barely realized she was holding her breath. Dain's small hand gripped her sleeve. Who is that? He whispered. Aelira had no answer. Minutes passed. Too many. Then the door opened again, and Rivik stepped inside, his face set in grim lines. He met Aelira's gaze, something unreadable in his expression. Pack a bag, he said. We need to go. Now. Aelira's stomach dropped. The fragile, impossible life they had built was crumbling beneath them. She had known this was coming. Hope had always been a dangerous thing. There was no time to question him, no time to ask for details. Aelira had spent enough of her life surviving to know when flight was the only option. She moved quickly, gathering what little they had. The children were silent, sensing the urgency, their movements quick but uncertain. Rivik was already pulling a heavy bag over his shoulder, checking a sidearm at his hip. He caught Aelira watching and shook his head. Not a fight we can win. Then what was that? She asked. Rivik exhaled. An old debt. Aelira stiffened. Of course. No one gave something for nothing. And yet, Rivik's gaze held no deception, only frustration. Regret. She wanted to trust him. She didn't have a choice. The streets were cold, the neon glow of Nova Primis casting long shadows as they moved through the winding corridors of the lower city. Rivik led them with practiced efficiency, taking back routes, avoiding cameras. It wasn't long before Aelira recognized where they were heading. The docks. Her pulse quickened. Rivik, what? Off-world, he said, not looking at her. That's the only way you're going to be safe. Aelira's breath hitched. Rivik hesitated just long enough for her to notice. I can't, he exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. I can't guarantee they won't follow me. But you and the kids, you can get out. No, that was not an option. You don't get to decide that, she said. Rivik turned to her fully, jaw clenched. Aelira, A sudden noise, sharp, metallic, cut through the air. Footsteps. Rivik swore under his breath. They had run out of time. Aelira tightened her grip on Kael's hand, her heart pounding. She had spent her life knowing that hope was dangerous. Now, she had to decide if it was worth the price. Aelira had never truly stopped running. Even in Rivik's home, in the warmth and quiet of stolen safety, she had always been waiting for this moment, the instant the illusion would crack and the chase would begin again. Now, as the heavy footfalls of pursuers echoed down the steel corridors of Nova Primis, her instincts sharpened like a blade. Rivik was already moving, his grip firm on the strap of his bag as he steered them into the shadows between two warehouses. Aelira followed, pulling Kael close, her other hand gripping Dain's. The boy's amber eyes darted toward the sound of approaching footsteps, his jaw set. He was afraid, but he said nothing. He had learned long ago that words would not save them. Aelira crouched beside him, pressing her fingers to his shoulder. Stay close, she whispered. Dain nodded. Rivik signaled for silence. His posture had shifted, no longer just the gruff mechanic, but something more. Something dangerous. The way he scanned the alley, the way he listened, the way his fingers twitched near his weapon. This was not a man unaccustomed to running. Who are you, Rivik? She had no time to ask. A low, metallic voice cut through the cold air. We know you're here, Rivik. Aelira's breath caught. Not we know you're here. Aliens. We know you're here, Rivik. The voice was synthesized, distorted through a vocal modulator, but something about it sent a chill through Aelira's blood. Not just the sound, but the weight behind it, the sense of inevitability of someone who was certain their quarry had nowhere left to run. Rivik muttered something under his breath. Then, before Aelira could ask, he moved. He grabbed her wrist, pulling her into motion, Dain and Kael following without hesitation. He led them through a narrow gap between storage units, past stacks of shipping crates, toward a loading dock lined with old freighters. There, an open access hatch, dim emergency lights flickering inside. A ship. Hope surged in Aelira's chest, warring with instinct. A chance. A way off this world. Then the first shot rang out. Energy discharge close, searing through the air. Rivik shoved her forward. Go. Get inside. Aelira didn't hesitate. She lifted Kael, practically throwing him through the hatch before turning to pull Dain up after him. The moment the boy's feet left the ground, a force struck Aelira's shoulder like a hammer. She gasped, stumbling against the ramp. Dain caught her wrist. Mama. Inside. Rivik barked. Aelira gritted her teeth, forcing herself upright. Pain burned along her arm, but she could still move. Still run. She turned in time to see Rivik raise his weapon and fire. A flash of red light. A body dropping behind the cover of a crate. Then, silence. The moment stretched thin. Rivik's breathing was heavy, his weapon still raised. Aelira's pulse pounded in her ears. Then movement. A shape stepped into the open. Tall. Wrapped in dark plating, cybernetic enhancements glinting beneath the neon haze of the docking lights. The pursuer. The one who had spoken. The helmet tilted slightly. This doesn't have to end in blood, Rivik. Rivik didn't lower his weapon. Seems like you already made that decision. The pursuer exhaled, the sound modulated through their vocal unit. You know what we want. Aelira glanced at Rivik, heart hammering. We. Not me. Not the children. Him. She had been right. This wasn't about her. She grabbed Rivik's sleeve. We have to go. Now. He didn't move. Aelira's stomach twisted. Rivik. The pursuer took another step forward. You're a smart man. You know what happens if you run. Rivik's jaw tightened. Then, before Aelira could speak, he turned and bolted for the ship. Aelira scrambled up the ramp after him, slamming her palm against the control panel. The hatches shut just as the first blast struck the hull. The freighter rumbled, engines whining to life. Rivik lunged for the cockpit. Aelira followed, nearly crashing into him as he slid into the pilot's seat, hands flying over the controls. "Tell me you know how to fly this," she gasped. Rivik's fingers tightened around the throttle. "Guess we'll find out." He yanked the lever. The ship lurched. Engines roared. And then, with a force that sent Aelira's stomach into freefall, they were airborne. The ship cut through the atmosphere, shaking violently as it fought against the pull of Nova Primis. The interior groaned, the old hull protesting against the strain. Kael clung to Aelira's waist, his tiny body trembling. Dain sat stiffly beside her, eyes wide but silent. Then silence. Weightlessness. The stars stretched wide beyond the viewport, endless and cold. They had made it. Aelira exhaled, pressing her forehead against the metal wall. Alive. They were still alive. Rivik, still gripping the controls, let out a sharp breath. Then, without looking at her, he said, "You're going to want to strap in. We're not out of this yet." Aelira stiffened. "They're following?" Rivik glanced at the sensors. A single red blip flashed behind them, gaining fast. Aelira's breath caught. "Who are they, Rivik?" For the first time, he hesitated. Then he said, "People I used to work for." Aelira's blood went cold. Before she could ask anything else, the ship jolted. Warning sirens blared. Rivik cursed. "They've got a lock on us." Aelira's grip tightened around Kael. "Can you lose them?" Rivik's jaw set. "Not in this piece of junk." Aelira's stomach twisted. She had risked everything for this moment, for this escape. And now, a sharp beep. An incoming hail. Rivik hesitated. Then, slowly, he reached for the console. A screen flickered to life. The pursuer. Their helmet gleamed in the dim light, the cold glow of their cybernetic eyes locking onto Rivik's. "You can't outrun us," they said. Rivik's fingers curled into fists. The pursuer tilted their head slightly. "You know what we want, Rivik." A pause. Then, "Give yourself up, and we'll let them go." Aelira's breath stopped. She turned to Rivik, heart hammering. She could see it in his face, the war behind his eyes. She shook her head. "No." Rivik didn't look at her. He was already deciding. Silence thickened the cockpit like a living thing. The cold, mechanical voice of the pursuer still echoed in Aelira's ears. "Give yourself up, and we'll let them go." Rivik stared at the transmission screen, his jaw locked tight, his fingers hovering over the controls. Aelira saw it in his face. The calculation. The resignation. He was going to do it. She grabbed his arm. "Don't." Rivik exhaled sharply, but didn't look at her. His voice was low, strained. "Aelira." "No," she tightened her grip. "I know that look. I've seen it before. You're about to make a deal you have no right to make." His fingers flexed. "They want me. Not you. Not the kids." Aelira's stomach twisted. She already knew that. But it didn't matter. "You think they'll let us go?" Her voice was sharp, a blade of cold reason slicing through whatever self-sacrificial nonsense was running through his mind. "You think they'll keep their word?" Rivik hesitated. Dain sat rigid beside her, silent and wide-eyed. Kael curled closer to her side, his small hands gripping the fabric of her coat. Aelira's breath came hard and fast. "Not again. Not again. I am not losing you," she said, voice fierce, barely more than a whisper. "Not like this." Rivik's jaw clenched, something shifting behind his eyes. Then, slowly, he reached forward and killed the transmission. The screen flickered to black. A moment of breathless silence. Then, the ship jolted violently, alarms blaring. "They fired on us," Rivik barked, snapping back into motion. "We're done talking." Aelira braced herself as the ship spun, the stars twisting outside the viewport. She could feel the pulse of the engine struggling under Rivik's demands, the hull rattling as another shot barely missed them. "They're faster than us," she said. "Yeah," Rivik muttered. "I noticed." He yanked the controls, sending the ship into a sharp dive. Aelira's stomach flipped. "You have a plan?" "Working on it." "That's not a plan." Rivik smirked despite the chaos. "It is if you say it with confidence." Aelira almost wanted to strangle him. But then he cut the engines. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, the ship went dead. The power flickered. The weightlessness of space settled heavy in her bones. Then, the enemy ship shot past them. Rivik didn't waste a second. He reactivated the thrusters, reversing direction in a heartbeat. "You were right," he muttered. "They won't let us go." Aelira had no time to ask what that meant before Rivik was already moving again, hands flying over the controls. They're tracking us, he said. If we jump now, they'll follow. We need a diversion. Aelira scanned the console, searching for anything useful. Weapons. Unless you count harsh language, no. Aelira swore under her breath. Then her eyes caught something on the navigation screen. A debris field ahead, broken remnants of old derelict ships, abandoned satellites, forgotten wreckage swallowed by the void. Take us through there, she said. Rivik blinked. Are you insane? Yes, she snapped. But they'll lose tracking if we break line of sight. Rivik hesitated only a second before muttering, hell with it. He turned the ship hard, angling straight for the debris field. The enemy ship adjusted course. Closing in. Kael whimpered. Mama. Aelira pressed a hand to his head. Hold on, love. Rivik's fingers tightened on the controls. And then, they plunged into the wreckage. The debris field swallowed them whole. Darkened husks of ships drifted in eerie silence, their metal bones twisted and broken. The ship's proximity alarm screamed as Rivik weaved between shattered hulls, scraping past ruins older than some worlds. Their pursuers hesitated. Aelira watched the scanners, breath caught in her throat. They were still there, but their movement slowed, cautious. They're trying not to wreck themselves, Rivik muttered. Smart. Aelira's mind raced. We need something bigger. Rivik shot her a look. What, exactly, would you like me to do, Aelira? Summon a black hole? She ignored the sarcasm. Instead, she scanned the field, searching. Then she saw it. A massive derelict drifting ahead, its hull cracked, but its structure still intact. And inside, a reactor. She knew the design. She had worked on ships like this before, back when her life had been something else entirely. She turned to Rivik. That wreck still has a reactor. Rivik stared at her. And she said, if we can overload it. Realization clicked in his eyes. It'll blow. Aelira nodded. Big enough to scramble their sensors. Maybe even take them out. Rivik exhaled. And I'm guessing you want me to do that. She lifted a brow. Unless you suddenly have an engineering degree? Rivik groaned, dragging a hand down his face. I hate this plan. I know. He sighed. Tell me what to do. Rivik pulled the ship in close, matching the wreck's slow rotation. The moment the airlock aligned, Aelira was already moving, grabbing a toolkit from the storage compartment. She turned to Dain, pressing a hand to his cheek. Stay here. Keep your brother safe. The boy nodded, his jaw tight. She didn't wait for Kael to protest before stepping out onto the wreck. Rivik followed. You better know what you're doing. Aelira smirked, despite the tension. I always do. The air inside the derelict was thin, stale. Cold. She moved fast, navigating the wreckage with an ease that surprised even herself. Muscle memory. A life she thought she had left behind. The reactor room was still intact, barely. She scanned the core, her mind already racing through calculations. Rivik watched her work. How long until it blows? Aelira didn't look up. Depends on how reckless you want me to be. Rivik scoffed. I'm starting to regret asking. She twisted a final wire. The reactor hummed, its broken system struggling to process the overload. She stood. We have 2 minutes. Rivik's eyes widened. 2? Aelira, that is not enough time. Then you'd better run fast. She grabbed his wrist and bolted. The explosion ripped through the void like a dying star. Rivik barely made it back to the ship before the shockwave hit. The enemy vessel, caught in the blast radius, veered wildly. The moment they were inside, Aelira gasped. Go. Rivik slammed the controls. The ship shot forward, engines burning hard. On the scanner, the red blip flickered. Then, gone. Silence. Aelira slumped against the wall, breathless. Rivik exhaled. We lost them. Dain looked up. Are we safe now? Aelira wanted to say yes, but she wasn't sure. She met Rivik's gaze. Something had changed between them. Not just survival. Not just necessity. Something deeper. Rivik ran a hand through his hair. So, where the hell are we going now? Aelira let out a breathless laugh. She had no idea. But for the first time in a long time, she was willing to find out. The void stretched before them, an endless sea of stars scattered across the abyss. The ship hummed beneath Aelira's fingertips, its systems stabilizing after the desperate escape. Rivik leaned back in the pilot's chair, exhaling hard. We should be dead. Aelira, still catching her breath, allowed herself a small, bitter smile. We're not. Rivik ran a hand through his hair, shaking his head. That was insane. Yes, she agreed. But it worked. He let out a dry laugh, the sound laced with exhaustion. Barely. Aelira's gaze drifted to the viewport. The enemy ship was gone, either destroyed in the explosion or knocked off their trail. For now. But she knew better than to believe they were safe. Behind her, Kael stirred in his blanket cocoon, rubbing his eyes sleepily. Mama. Aelira knelt beside him, brushing his golden curls back. We're okay, love. Kael blinked up at her, still half dreaming. No more bad people? Aelira's chest tightened. No more, she said softly, though she wasn't sure if it was a promise she could keep. Dain, ever the quiet observer, sat nearby, watching her. He didn't speak, but she could see the question in his eyes. What now? She didn't have an answer. Rivik must have sensed it because he sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. So, any bright ideas on where we go next? Aelira hesitated. Her people had cast her out. Nova Primis was lost to them. The enemy that had come for Rivik, whoever they were, wouldn't stop hunting. She had spent so long running, but they couldn't run forever. She glanced at the star maps flickering on the navigation panel. One world stood out. A distant station on the edges of human-controlled space. A place rumored to be lawless, free of interference from both the Galactic Syndicate and the remnants of the Aedari Dominion, her people's former empire. A place where no one asked questions. Caldrus Station, she said finally. Rivik's brows lifted. You want to go to Caldrus? It's safe. It's a criminal haven. Aelira met his gaze. We're out of options. He stared at her for a long moment, then muttered, hell. He turned back to the console. Caldrus it is. The ship adjusted course, the engines burning toward a destination neither of them could predict. Caldrus Station was a floating carcass, ancient and rusted, hanging in the void like the bones of some forgotten giant. It wasn't a place of law or order, but of barter and survival. Aelira had only heard rumors, stories of war deserters, black market traders, and those who had slipped through the cracks of their own civilizations. It was exactly what they needed. Rivik guided the ship toward one of the outer docking rings. Try not to make eye contact with anyone once we're inside. Kael scrunched his nose. Why? Rivik smirked. Because most people here don't like questions, kid. Dain frowned. Then why are we going? Aelira answered before Rivik could. Because we need a place to disappear. Rivik shot her a look, but said nothing. The docking clamps engaged with a heavy clunk. The airlock hissed open. Aelira took a deep breath. Then, with Kael's small hand in hers and Dain at her side, she stepped into the underbelly of the galaxy. The station was a maze of narrow corridors, neon flickering in the gloom. Vendors lined the main pathways, selling everything from spare ship parts to questionable food. The air smelled of rust, oil, and something acrid. Rivik led the way, keeping one hand near the concealed weapon at his hip. Aelira stayed close, scanning the crowd. No signs of pursuit. Yet, we need to find a contact, Rivik murmured. Someone who can get us fake credentials, maybe a new transponder for the ship. And credits? Aelira asked. Rivik sighed. Yeah, that too. Aelira exhaled, already calculating what she could offer in trade. Her engineering skills. Maybe salvage work. Whatever it took. She had promised Dain and Kael they were safe. She had to make it true. They turned a corner, stepping into the dim light of a rundown cantina filled with mercenaries, smugglers, and drifters. Aelira barely noticed them, because at the far end of the room, sitting alone, was someone she had never expected to see again. Her breath caught. Her heart hammered. The man at the table lifted his gaze. His violet skin marked him as Aedari, as one of her own kind. And worse, she knew him. His golden eyes widened in shock. Aelira. Her past had found her. The cantina buzzed with low voices, the murmur of deals and threats exchanged over cheap drinks. But in that moment, Aelira heard nothing. The man stood slowly, his chair scraping against the metal floor. She had thought she would never see another Aedari again. And yet, there he was. Older, hardened, but unmistakable. Tyreek, she whispered. Rivik's posture shifted, tense. Friend of yours? Tyreek's gaze flicked to Rivik, assessing. Then back to Aelira. You were supposed to be dead. Aelira stiffened. I was supposed to be forgotten. Tyreek's expression darkened. They exiled you. A pause. They exiled the children too? Aelira felt Dain press closer to her side. Kael peered up at Tyreek curiously, his small voice breaking the tension. Are you like Mama? Tyreek's gaze softened, just slightly. I am, little one. Rivik exhaled sharply. This reunion's real heartwarming. but we don't exactly have time for nostalgia. Tyreek's golden eyes met his. And who are you? Rivik smirked. The guy keeping them alive. A tense silence. Then, Tyreek nodded. Good. Aelira's heart pounded. What are you doing here, Tyreek? He hesitated. Then, voice low, he said. I know who's hunting you. The words sent ice through Aelira's veins. She swallowed. Who? Tyreek exhaled. They call themselves the Syndicate. He glanced around the cantina, as if measuring who might be listening. They don't just want Rivik. His gaze locked onto hers. They want you. Aelira's breath stopped. Rivik muttered a curse. Kael, still too young to understand, tugged at her sleeve. Mama. She forced herself to steady. This wasn't over. It had never been over. And if what Tyreek said was true, then running was no longer an option. Aelira's pulse roared in her ears, drowning out the low hum of conversation around them. The cantina blurred, its patrons reduced to shadows at the edges of her vision. They don't just want Rivik. They want you. She forced herself to breathe. Steady. Focused. She had survived exile, the cold streets of Nova Primis, the merciless void between the stars. She would survive this, too. Rivik, standing close, exhaled sharply. I hate to be the guy asking the obvious question, but why the hell would a group like the Syndicate be after her? Tyreek's gaze flicked between them, measuring, calculating. Because she's not just any exile. Aelira's stomach twisted. Rivik lifted a brow. Care to elaborate? Tyreek hesitated, just long enough for Aelira to know the answer was dangerous. I need to show you something. His voice was lower now, careful. Not here. Rivik's lips thinned, but he gave a short nod. Fine. But if this is a trap, you should know I'm not in the mood to die today. Tyreek's golden eyes gleamed. Neither am I. Aelira glanced at her children. Kael had pressed himself against her side, peering at Tyreek with open curiosity. Dain, older, more perceptive, studied the man warily, already calculating the risk. She squeezed his shoulder. Stay close. Dain nodded. Tyreek led them out of the cantina, winding through the narrow metal corridors of Caldra's station. Aelira kept one hand on Kael, her other resting lightly on the knife hidden beneath her coat. Rivik walked beside her, his usual air of ease replaced with sharp tension. Minutes passed before they reached their destination, a door tucked between rusted storage units. Tyreek pressed a code into the panel, and with a hiss, the door unlocked. Inside, the room was small, dimly lit. A workbench cluttered with datapads, old circuitry, and scavenged components sat against the far wall. A terminal flickered to life as Tyreek moved toward it. He typed in a command. Aelira's breath caught. A symbol appeared on the screen. She recognized it instantly. A sigil of twisting silver lines, once worn only by the highest within the Adari Dominion. Aelira's throat tightened. That shouldn't exist. Rivik glanced at her. Mind explaining? Tyreek leaned against the console, arms crossed. The Dominion didn't fall as completely as you were led to believe. His voice was unreadable. A fragment survived. Aelira swallowed hard. That's impossible. Tyreek's gaze met hers. Is it? Rivik let out a sharp laugh. Okay, let's assume for a second that some ghost of the Dominion is still kicking around. What does that have to do with Aelira? Tyreek hesitated, his golden eyes unreadable. Then he said, because she is the last heir. The room fell silent. Rivik blinked. I'm sorry, what? Aelira's chest constricted. Tyreek turned to her fully. You were exiled because they needed you gone. Not because you were weak, not because of tradition. He nodded toward the screen. Because of this. Aelira felt the weight of it like a crushing force. Her exile had never been about her husband's death. It had been about erasing her. Because she was a threat. Because she was important. Rivik let out a slow, low whistle. So let me get this straight. He gestured vaguely between Aelira and the terminal. You're actually some kind of lost queen? Aelira's hands curled into fists. I am no one's queen. Tyreek tilted his head. Then why is the Syndicate hunting you? She had no answer. Dain, who had been silent all this time, spoke quietly. What do they want with her? Tyreek's expression darkened. That's what we need to find out. The Syndicate, a name spoken only in whispers. No one knew exactly what they were. Mercenaries, crime lords, or something worse. What was certain was that when they came for you, there were only two options. You vanished, or you obeyed. Aelira refused to do either. Rivik paced the small room, running a hand through his hair. Okay, great. Fantastic. We have a whole interstellar crime syndicate after us because my favorite engineer/refugee turned out to be royalty. What's our next move? Tyreek's golden gaze was steady. We get information. Rivik snorted. From who? You got a guy? Tyreek smirked. I do, actually. Aelira exhaled. Where? Tyreek's expression shifted. And that's when Aelira knew she wasn't going to like the answer. The deep levels of Caldra's station were not meant for those who still believed in morality. The black auction was where debts were paid in blood, where secrets were currency, and where lives were traded like commodities. Aelira felt the weight of Kael's small hand in hers, grounding her. She had debated leaving the children behind in the ship, but she wouldn't take that risk. Not here. Not with the syndicate watching. Rivik's eyes darted warily across the room as they entered. I hate this place. Tyreek smirked. Then you're smarter than you look. The auction floor stretched before them, dimly lit by deep red glow strips. Hushed voices murmured deals in shadowed corners. At the far end, a stage loomed, where the night's merchandise would be sold to the highest bidder. Aelira forced herself to breathe. They were here to find a contact, someone who knew why the syndicate was after her. She felt a hand on her shoulder. Rivik, his grip firm, grounding. You okay? His voice was low. She nodded, though she wasn't sure it was true. Tyreek led them through the maze of traders and mercenaries until they reached a figure seated in a private booth. The man was old, his cybernetic implants rusted with age, his eyes sharp and predatory. Rivik muttered, "Oh, I really hate this guy." Tyreek ignored him. Jean. The old man lifted his gaze. A slow smile stretched across his scarred face. Tyreek, you always bring me the most interesting guests. His mechanical fingers tapped the table. And this one, his gaze flickered to Aelira, assessing. Aelira met his stare, unflinching. Jean grinned wider. Oh yes, they are looking for you. Rivik stiffened. Who's they? Jean chuckled. Now. Information is expensive. Aelira stepped forward. Then name your price. Jean studied her, something dark flickering behind his gaze. Then, slowly, he leaned in. I don't need credits, he said softly. I need a favor. Aelira's blood ran cold. She had spent years trading pieces of herself for survival. But this was something else. Rivik's hand hovered near his weapon. You better choose your next words carefully, old man. Jean chuckled. Relax, human. It's nothing too unreasonable. He smiled. And then he whispered, I need someone dead. Aelira's breath slowed. The words hung in the air between them, thick with the weight of inevitability. I need someone dead. Jean leaned back, his metallic fingers steepled, watching her. She could feel Rivik tensing beside her, his body coiled like a loaded weapon. Tyreek remained still, unreadable, but Aelira knew what this meant. They needed information. And now, they had a choice. Kill for it, or walk away blind. Aelira's jaw tightened. Who? Jean grinned like a man who had already won. An old associate of mine. Goes by the name of Kael. Rivik's expression darkened. You mean Kael the Butcher? Jean inclined his head. The very same. Aelira knew the name, even from the fragments of her old life. Kael was more than a criminal. He was a monster. Slaver, war profiteer, and worse. Jean's eyes glinted. You kill him, and I'll tell you everything you want to know. Aelira's stomach twisted. She had killed before. Not often, and never without cause. But murder for trade? Dain shifted at her side, watching her, waiting for her answer. She exhaled. Where? Kael was holed up in the upper levels of Caldra's station, in a heavily guarded penthouse overlooking the sprawling chaos below. Tyreek secured them access codes. Rivik modified their weapons, preparing for the inevitable firefight. Aelira sat with Dain and Kael in their borrowed quarters, brushing Kael's hair as he curled against her. Do you have to go? Kael murmured sleepily. She pressed a kiss to his forehead. I do, love. Dain, sitting stiffly beside her, swallowed hard. Be careful. She cupped his face. Always. Then, without another word, she rose and left to meet Rivik and Tyreek. It was time. The assault was fast. Brutal. They moved in shadows, cutting through Kael's guards with precise efficiency. Rivik took point, his pistol barking in the dim corridors. Tyreek fought with silent grace, his movements lethal and efficient. Aelira was the one who found Kael. The butcher. He was older than she expected, his bloated body wrapped in silk and stolen finery. He saw her, and he laughed. "Ah," he rasped. "They sent a widow to kill me?" Aelira fired without hesitation. The shot struck true. Creel gasped, clutching his chest, his laughter dying in a wet gurgle. Aelira watched as the life faded from his eyes. No regret. No mercy. Then she turned and walked away. Jean was waiting when they returned. "Well," he said, swirling a drink in his mechanical fingers, "I underestimated you." Aelira sat across from him, her expression stone. "Talk." Jean chuckled, then tapped the terminal beside him. A hologram flickered to life, displaying a series of files. The Syndicate wasn't hunting Aelira because she was an heir. They were hunting her because she was a key. Her DNA, her very existence, was tied to an ancient Dominion relic, one that could either restore what was lost or destroy it forever. Rivik cursed. Tyreek went rigid. Aelira just stared. She had spent her life believing she was nothing. Now, she was everything. Jean smirked. "So tell me, exile, what will you do with this knowledge?" Aelira rose. She had spent years running. No more. She turned to Rivik, to Tyreek, to the children waiting for her. "I'm going to end this." The Syndicate's fleet loomed on the edges of the system, waiting. Aelira stood on the bridge of their stolen freighter, staring at the approaching ships. They had tracked her. They wanted their key. She clenched her fists. Rivik stood beside her, his pistol strapped to his hip. Tyreek was at the controls, preparing their next move. Dain and Kael were safe, hidden away. This would end tonight. The battle was chaos. They tore through the Syndicate's blockade, slipping between their warships with desperate precision. Rivik fought like a demon, cutting down anyone who boarded their ship. Tyreek piloted with ruthless skill. And Aelira, she found their leader. A masked figure, a voice distorted by cybernetics. She fought, and when the mask fell, she gasped. It was someone she had once trusted, someone she had once loved. The betrayal was a knife to her ribs. But she did not waver. With one final shot, she ended it. The Syndicate shattered. The hunt was over. And for the first time in years, Aelira was free. They drifted through space, quiet in the aftermath. Rivik leaned against the console, exhausted but alive. "So, what now?" Aelira turned to him. To Tyreek. To her sons. A future stretched before them, uncertain but theirs. Aelira smiled. "We find a home. And this time, they would keep it." The end.